The pronouncement spoke of the Emperor's divine protection, yet remained conspicuously silent on the true nature of the threats he supposedly shielded us from. That bitter truth solidified during my third deployment, a deployment etched forever in memory, when the heavens above us bled the sickly hue of infected wounds and the very earth beneath our boots began to shriek, a cacophony of agony. I am Trooper Cadius Vex of the 3rd Regiment, Mordian Iron Guard, or rather I was. My name, along with any other markers of personal identity, now means profoundly less than the crushing weight of the burdens I carry, the specter of memories that pursue me relentlessly through the void between worlds, and the chilling certainty that each new dawn might well be my final one. I have dedicated 14 years to the service of the Imperium, endured and survived 18 major engagements, and borne witness to the deaths of 743 men who served under my direct command. Indeed, these stark, brutal figures define the very essence of who I am far more profoundly than any mere name ever could. The recruitment officer, whose immaculate hands and pristine, oppressively tailored uniform stood in stark contrast to my squalid existence, found me in the grimy underhive of Morius Prime. He wove intoxicating tales of glory, of unwavering service to the Golden Throne, of a destiny where I could transcend the wretched gutter-born scum I then was, to become something far greater. He lied about everything he uttered, with the sole exception of that uniform. That, at least, possessed an undeniable reality. Every other word was nothing more than carefully constructed propaganda, meticulously designed to meet arbitrary quotas and relentlessly feed the insatiable meat grinder of eternal war. Our boot camp, a crucible of transformation, lasted a grueling 6 months. During that time, we were drilled relentlessly, learning to march in flawless formation, to field strip and meticulously clean a laser gun even amidst corrosive, toxic rain, and above all, to obey orders without a shred of question, even when those commands defied all logic and reason. Their first priority was to systematically dismantle us, stripping away any lingering, foolish notions we might have harbored concerning individuality, personal choice, or the perilous luxury of moral reasoning. Only then, once our old selves were shattered, did they painstakingly rebuild us. As hardened soldiers, as unquestioning instruments of the Emperor's divine will, as utterly expendable assets in humanity's relentless, endless war for survival. I distinctly recall the first life I took, not that of an orc, nor a vile heretic, nor some grotesque alien abomination, but a man, an Imperial citizen, in fact, born beneath the very same stars as I, and nurtured by the very same seductive lies concerning duty and honor. He wore the uniform of the secessionist rebels, but beneath those defiant colors, he bled the same rich crimson as any of us. I put 3 precise Las rounds into his chest and watched dispassionately as the light of life extinguished itself in his eyes. And in that moment, the only thought that pierced through the haze of training was how tragically young he appeared, and how profoundly terrified. That incident occurred on Heathguard during what was officially designated the Pacification Campaign. We branded it Pacification because to call it by its true name would have been an unforgivable act of honesty. What it truly was slaughter. A systematic, brutally efficient, and we were told necessary, slaughter of Imperial citizens whose sole crime was the audacity to believe they possessed the right to govern themselves. The Departamento Munitorum, with characteristic bureaucratic detachment, classified the entire operation as nothing more than a training exercise. Real bullets, real casualties, yet training nonetheless, a perverse indoctrination. We were, in essence, being meticulously trained in the art of killing our own species, a grim prerequisite before being deployed to eradicate alien threats. Even in my raw, nascent state as a soldier, the bitter irony of this situation was not lost upon me. We spent our days performing summary executions of men and women whose sole transgression was desiring freedom from the suffocating, crushing weight of imperial bureaucracy, while our evenings were consumed by Commissar's fervent lectures on the sacred duty of protecting humanity from its myriad external enemies. Such profound cognitive dissonance should, by all rights, have driven me to madness. Instead, it instilled in me the very first and most enduring lesson of military service. That truth, in the crucible of war, is simply whatever your commanding officer decrees it to be. Heathguard, a world already scarred, reeked perpetually of burning promethium and the cloying sweetness of rotting corpses. The rebels, in a desperate act of defiance, had sabotaged the atmospheric processors before our planetfall, ensuring the air was a noxious stew thick with industrial toxins and the pervasive, sickeningly sweet stench of decay. We donned rebreathers whenever possible, yet supplies were always critically limited and replacements agonizingly rare. Most of us quickly learned to breathe shallowly through our mouths, forcing ourselves to ignore the searing agony the poisoned air inflicted upon our lungs. Adaptation was not merely a choice, it was the sole path to survival. Complaints, conversely, were unforgivable weakness. I served under the command of Colonel Marcus Vra, a grim, implacable man who meticulously measured success not by strategic victories, but by the cold, unforgiving metrics of body counts and operational efficiency. He had spent 3 decades embroiled in relentless warfare against rebels and heretics, and the endless conflict had long since scoured away every vestige of softness within him, leaving only razor-sharp edges and an unwavering, brutal pragmatism. He never once raised his voice, never betrayed a hint of anger or frustration, never displayed any flicker of emotion that might suggest he still recalled what it meant to be human. We feared him, in truth, far more profoundly than we feared the enemy. The enemy, at least, offered the grim mercy of a swift death. Colonel Vra subscribed to a philosophy of discipline forged through sheer, unremitting exhaustion, a method designed to systematically break men down until nothing remained but their ingrained training and a paralyzing fear of his disapproval. We were forced to march 20 kilometers daily in full combat kit, permitted a mere 4 hours of sleep out of every 24, and sustained by field rations that possessed the flavor and texture of recycled cardboard mixed with synthetic protein. Those who dared voice a complaint were immediately assigned extra duties. Those who complained a second time were brutally flogged, and those who complained a third time simply vanished, leaving no trace. I, along with countless others, quickly learned the vital, terrifying lesson: never to complain. The standard issue weapon I received was a Mark IV infantry laser gun, bearing the serial number 7645 Delta Morius. I committed that number to memory, along with its precise weight when fully charged, the subtle whine it emitted as the power pack neared depletion, and the distinctive way its barrel heated up after sustained, intense firing. That laser gun, in its stark utility, became more intimately familiar to me than my own reflection. I could field, strip it blindfolded, recalibrate its focusing lens in absolute darkness, and deftly clear a jam even under a torrent of enemy fire. It was, quite simply, the essential tool that kept me alive. And like any tool of survival, it demanded constant, meticulous maintenance and absolute, unwavering respect. But tools, however robust, eventually break. Men, tragically, break far, far faster. On Heathguard, within the initial month, we lost a staggering 30% of our fighting strength. These casualties were not due to enemy action, but rather to a grim litany of accidents, equipment failures, and what the medical officers, with their typical bureaucratic euphemism, termed stress-related incidents. Men would inexplicably walk into the path of moving vehicles, stumble into exposed reactor pits, or simply, one day, sit down and quietly refuse to ever stand again. The human mind, after all, possesses its inherent limits, and war, in its brutal efficiency, has an insidious way of uncovering every single one of them. I watched Trooper Kellen, a naive farm boy hailing from the agri-world of Thessia, slowly, agonizingly lose his capacity to distinguish between friend and foe. It began with subtle, nervous glances cast at his squad mates, escalated to paranoid accusations that they were attempting to poison his field rations, and culminated in a desperate attempt to bayonet Sergeant Herrick during morning inspection. The accompanying commissar, without hesitation, put a bolt round through Kellen's head before he could inflict harm upon anyone else. His body was left precisely where it fell, and we, without missing a beat, continued our mission. There was no time, nor any spare emotional energy for funerals or for grief. That was the defining moment when I truly grasped our true nature. We were not soldiers in any romanticized sense, nor were we heroes, nor even valiant defenders of humanity. No, we were merely ammunition, our worth precisely measured by our remaining utility, and ruthlessly discarded the moment we became more of a liability than an asset. The Imperium, with its countless worlds and staggering populations, suffered no shortage of young men and women eager to die for the Emperor. What it perpetually lacked, however, was time. And time remained the singular, implacable enemy we could never hope to truly defeat. The rebels on Heathguard, a force born of desperation, fought us with captured Imperial weaponry, crude improvised explosives, and the raw, unadulterated fury of people who understood, with chilling clarity, that they were already condemned to die. They were not, by any conventional definition, organized military formations. Yet, they possessed an intimate understanding of the treacherous terrain, a seamless ability to blend into the civilian population, and, crucially, absolutely nothing left to lose. These advantages, simple yet profound, rendered them a far more dangerous foe than entire orc warbands. We hunted them relentlessly through the desolate ruins of their own cities, tracking their elusive movements via thermal signatures and the telltale crimson trails of blood, weaving through bombed-out hab blocks and vast, collapsed industrial complexes. The architecture of Heathguard, like so many Imperial worlds, was a testament to grim, utilitarian design, massive, brutalist, and conceived more for overwhelming psychological impact than for practical habitability. The rebels, with their intimate knowledge, exploited this against us, transforming every labyrinthine corridor into a potential kill zone and every elevated balcony into a deadly sniper's nest. Every seemingly innocuous door might conceal a brutal ambush. Every shattered window might harbor a hidden marksman, and every encroaching shadow held the potential to be the very last thing we ever perceived. I claimed my second life in a cramped, reeking maintenance tunnel, deep beneath Manufacturing District 7. He was already gravely wounded, a dark stain of blood spreading from a shrapnel wound in his leg, as he desperately tried to crawl away from the ominous echo of our boots in the suffocating darkness. He could not have been more than 16 years of age, likely a factory worker who, in a moment of desperate idealism or fear, had taken up a rifle when the rebellion first ignited. When he saw the crimson targeting beam of my laser gun settle irrevocably upon his chest, he offered no pleas for mercy, made no attempt to negotiate. He simply closed his eyes and waited, accepting his fate. I hesitated, not out of any nascent compassion, but from a sudden, profound, and utterly overwhelming sense of tragic waste. Here lay a young man whose rightful destiny should have involved learning a trade, perhaps starting a family, contributing meaningfully to the vast, crushing stability of the Imperium. Instead, he was dying in a fetid tunnel, permeated with the metallic tang of industrial coolant and the acrid stench of human excrement, killed by someone barely older than himself, for reasons that, in that moment, neither of us truly comprehended. The hesitation lasted perhaps 3 agonizing seconds. Then the ingrained, ruthless efficiency of training reasserted itself, and I pulled the trigger. The last beam punched cleanly through his sternum, instantly arresting his heart. He died with his eyes still closed, perhaps, in his final moments, dreaming of home. That night, as I lay rigidly in my bunk, I found myself attempting a morbid calculation. How many lives had I been responsible for ending since our arrival on Heathguard? Direct kills were, morbidly, simple to tally. But what of the devastating artillery strikes I had called in? The precision air support I had coordinated, or the crucial intelligence I had provided that led to successful, yet deadly, raids. By any honest, unforgiving accounting, I was directly responsible for the deaths of dozens of individuals, most of whom I had never even glimpsed and would never know. The fundamental mathematics of war are brutally simple. You eliminate the enemy before the enemy eliminates you. Everything beyond that cold equation is philosophy. And philosophy in our desperate profession is a perilous luxury that soldiers simply cannot afford. I learned with an agonizing effort to cease counting, to cease questioning, to cease feeling anything beyond the primal animal satisfaction of merely surviving another day. The alternative was utter madness. And madness in this war was merely another, equally undesirable form of casualty. We endured 11 brutal months on Heathguard, 11 months comprised of relentless urban warfare, grinding counterinsurgency operations, and what the ubiquitous propaganda broadcasts laughably termed morale and welfare activities. These morale and welfare activities invariably involved public executions, forced mass deportations, and the systematic, deliberate destruction of anything that might conceivably serve as a symbol of local identity or cultural heritage. We burned ancient libraries to ash, systematically demolished revered monuments, and summarily executed anyone discovered in possession of pre-rebellion historical documents. We were not merely conquering a world. We were, with cold precision, erasing its very memory, its entire history. By the time the pacification campaign finally concluded, Heathguard had been utterly transformed, appearing as a completely different planet. Its once thriving cities lay in utter ruin. Its population was either systematically eradicated or forcibly relocated, and its vital industrial infrastructure had been so thoroughly demolished that its rebuilding would require decades, perhaps even centuries. The Departamento Munitorum, in its official pronouncements, classified the operation as a complete success. We had, they declared, achieved all strategic objectives with acceptable losses and minimal resource expenditure. The inconvenient truth that we had, in effect, committed genocide was conveniently omitted from all official reports. Following the Heathguard campaign, I was promoted to the rank of Lance Corporal. This promotion brought with it a negligible increase in pay, the dubious privilege of a slightly larger bunk, and the added responsibility of ensuring that newer recruits avoided making the same mistakes I had already endured. More significantly, it came with the chilling knowledge that I was now inextricably invested in the system, that I had crossed a moral Rubicon from which there was no return. I was no longer merely following orders. I was now issuing them. The transport ship that eventually carried us away from the ravaged surface of Heathguard was an ancient sword-class frigate, grimly christened the Emperor's Judgment. It had been in continuous service for over 2 millennia, and every scarred surface bore the accumulated wear and tear of countless brutal deployments. Its cramped corridors were claustrophobically narrow. Its archaic air recyclers wheezed with a constant asthmatic groan, and its artificial gravity fluctuated with unsettling unpredictability. Yet for all its imperfections, it was clean, it felt safe, and crucially, it was carrying us far away from Heathguard. For that fleeting moment, that alone was enough. Space travel, particularly in the arduous service of the Imperium, bears no resemblance whatsoever to the sanitized, heroic journey so glibly depicted in the ubiquitous propaganda vids. Instead, it is a monotonous existence of cramped quarters, crushing boredom, and pervasive discomfort, punctuated by sudden, visceral moments of absolute terror when critical ship systems inevitably malfunction or when we violently encounter hostile forces. The vast majority of our time was consumed by enforced idleness, playing grimy cards, meticulously maintaining our equipment, and, perhaps most importantly, desperately trying not to dwell on the grim uncertainty of our next destination. The ship's permanent crew regarded us with the casual, almost disdainful indifference that naval personnel typically reserve for mere ground forces. To them, we were simply cargo, human freight to be efficiently transported from one brutal battle zone to the next. They had their own pressing concerns, their own unique dangers to contend with, and their own distinct methods of coping with the endless, grinding war. We, in turn, respected those unspoken boundaries, and in doing so, they mostly left us to our own devices. Our eventual destination was Carax Prime, a sprawling, decaying hive world situated precariously on the volatile border between Imperial space and the Orc-held systems of the Ghoul Stars. Intelligence reports indicated that Orc raiders were utilizing the world as a primary staging ground for increasingly aggressive, deeper incursions into sacred Imperial territory. Our grim mission was explicitly defined: locate and utterly destroy all Orc bases, eliminate any human collaborators found complicit, and secure the world's vital strategic resources. It sounded on paper entirely routine. In reality, it was anything but. Carax Prime, we soon discovered, was a world in its death throes. Its colossal hive cities were in advanced stages of collapse. Its vital atmospheric processors were failing catastrophically. And its terrified population was in full flight, desperately seeking refuge on any world that would accept them. What remained was a volatile mix. Die-hard loyalists too stubbornly resolute to abandon their homes, opportunistic criminal elements gleefully exploiting the pervasive chaos, and a disturbing number of orc sympathizers who perceived collaboration as their only viable path to survival. It was, in other words, precisely the type of unfolding nightmare scenario for which the Imperial Guard was specifically designed and brutally trained. We executed planetfall in Dropship Formation Delta 7, a textbook combat insertion that deposited us amidst the desolate ruins of Hive Secundus during what passed for the local dawn. The sky above was the color of ancient clotted blood, further fouled by industrial pollution and the omnipresent smoke from countless smoldering fires. The air itself tasted acrid, of raw metal and pervasive decay, and the rhythmic thud of our boots on the shattered rockcrete echoed through the desolate, empty streets like a volley of gunshots. The orcs, undeniably, had been here. Their crude, violent glyphs defaunks every still intact wall. Their ramshackle, brutal vehicles littered the main thoroughfares, and the grim trophies of their victims hung from improvised gibbets throughout the lower, decaying districts. But the orcs themselves were gone, having moved on to some other unsuspecting target, leaving behind only the indelible evidence of their destructive passage and the desperate human scavengers who now picked over the wreckage. We established our forward operating base within the sturdy shell of what had once served as a Departamento Munitorum supply depot. The building, remarkably, remained largely intact, offered sound defensive positions, and was conveniently located close enough to the old Imperial Command Center to provide an excellent observation post. More critically, it possessed working water recyclers and a partially functional power grid. By the grim standards of the Imperial Guard, these were truly luxurious accommodations. The initial week on Carax Prime passed with an unsettling, deceptive quiet. We conducted extensive patrols through the desolate, dead sectors, managed to establish tenuous contact with scattered surviving loyalist groups, and initiated the laborious process of mapping the world's shattered infrastructure. Actionable intelligence was critically scarce, communications proved frustratingly intermittent, and every fragmented piece of information we painstakingly gathered pointed to a situation far more dire than anyone had initially comprehended. The orcs, it became chillingly clear, had not merely raided Carax Prime, they had fundamentally infected it. Their insidious spores were omnipresent, growing stealthily in the dark corners of abandoned buildings, sprouting insidiously amidst the ruins of collapsed hab blocks, and contaminating both the critical water supplies and the remaining air recycling systems. Given sufficient time, those spores would inevitably mature into fully grown orcs, creating a self-sustaining enemy that could never be truly or completely eliminated. Every Imperial world touched by the Greenkins carried this insidious hidden threat, this biological time bomb perpetually poised to erupt into unimaginable violence at any given moment. We began encountering the collaborators during our second unsettling week planetside. They were disturbingly easy to identify, noticeably better fed than the other emaciated survivors, better armed, and bearing the crude, often grotesque tattoos that Orc society employed to brand its human servants. Some, no doubt, had been coerced into their vile collaboration through dire threats against their families. Others, however, had embraced it willingly, seduced by insidious promises of power, or simply by the overwhelming prospect of bare survival in a world where survival itself was the only victory of any conceivable consequence. Colonel Vra's standing orders concerning collaborators were chillingly explicit. Summary execution was mandated for anyone found guilty of willful cooperation with Xenos forces. The precise definition of willful, however, was left entirely to our discretion, which in practice meant it was dictated by our ingrained prejudices, our burgeoning fears, and our desperate, overwhelming need to assign blame for the pervasive horror we were witnessing. I carried out the execution of my first collaborator on a desolate Tuesday. He was a middle-aged clerk whose fatal transgression had been assisting the orcs in identifying which buildings contained strategic resources and which were deemed expendable. He claimed in his final moments that he had merely been trying to save lives, that cooperation had been the only conceivable path to prevent an even more total massacre. He might even have been speaking the truth, but it did not matter. Not in the slightest. The colonel's orders were stark and unambiguous orders were the only bulwark separating us from the encroaching, all-consuming chaos. The man's name was Rick Voss. He had 2 young children and a wife 7 months pregnant. They watched, terrified, from a barricaded window as I delivered a last round squarely through his skull. His lifeless body slumped into a shallow puddle of contaminated water, and the ripples of his death spread slowly outward, a dark stain reaching the very edges of the ravaged street. I then ordered his shell-shocked family to dispose of the corpse. They were, after all, still technically Imperial citizens, and the disposal of traitors was presented as a grim civic duty. That night, tormented by the day's events, I dreamed of Rick Voss. In the dream, he was vividly alive, still desperately attempting to rationalize his choices, still clinging to the naive belief that reasonable people might find reasonable solutions to problems that were, by their very nature, utterly unreasonable. I woke abruptly with the metallic taste of blood in my mouth and the phantom crackle of lasfire echoing persistently in my ears. These disturbing dreams would continue to plague me for months, long after Karak's Prime had faded into nothing more than another grim entry in my official service record. The orcs returned with terrifying ferocity during our 3rd week on Karak's Prime. Not a mere raiding party, but a full-fledged WAG! Thousands upon thousands of green-skinned killers, a tide of pure aggression, spearheaded by a colossal war boss whose guttural roar resonated for kilometers across the ravaged landscape. They advanced in ramshackle patchwork vehicles, seemingly held together by sheer scrap metal and an unshakable blind faith. They wielded weapons that defied all logic by functioning, and displayed an unbridled, feral enthusiasm for violence that made our own rigorous training appear almost quaintly sophisticated by comparison. We numbered perhaps 600 men. They brought with them over 10,000 orcs, augmented by an unknown, horrifying number of grots, squigs, and whatever other monstrous denizens they had accumulated along their destructive path. The grim mathematics were brutally simple. We were going to die. The only pertinent question that remained was how much damage we could possibly inflict before their overwhelming numbers inevitably overran our beleaguered positions. Colonel Vra, ever the pragmatist, termed it a target-rich environment. In his own stark, unfeeling way, he was not entirely wrong. There was certainly an abundance of orcs to shoot at. The fundamental problem, however, was that shooting them seemed only to enrage them further. And an enraged orc was a far more terrifying and dangerous foe than a normal orc. They knew no fear, demonstrated no mercy, and regarded warfare not as a grim necessity, but as the ultimate, most exhilarating form of entertainment. In many respects, they were the perfect enemy, predictable in their very unpredictability, refreshingly honest in their savage brutality, and utterly fanatically committed to the only values that held any meaning in a galaxy perpetually consumed by war. The initial assault began at dawn, heralded by a thunderous "wag" cry that rattled dust from the reinforced ceiling of our command bunker. Hundreds of orc vehicles, crude and monstrous, charged with suicidal abandon across the exposed ground, separating the outer ruins from our defensive perimeter, their engines belching forth torrents of black, oily smoke, and their feral crews howling with unadulterated bestial glee. They plunged headlong into our carefully established kill zones, seemingly utterly oblivious to the concentrated last fire and devastating heavy weapons that tore gaping holes through their advancing ranks. But it simply did not matter. For every single orc vehicle we managed to destroy, two more seemed to immediately materialize and take its place. For every orc we cut down, three more appeared from the swirling chaos. They were not, in any conventional sense we understood, fighting a war. No, they were celebrating, reveling with primal abandon in the pure, unadulterated joy of violence unleashed. Our meticulously disciplined fire and carefully planned tactics were, to them, merely an engaging part of the grand game, obstacles to be joyfully overcome rather than existential threats to be meticulously avoided. I spent that initial, chaotic battle crouched low behind a flimsy, makeshift barricade, firing controlled, precise bursts at targets that, with each passing moment, seemed to multiply exponentially even as I watched. My laser gun grew agonizingly hot in my hands, its power pack indicator rapidly plummeting from verdant green to anxious amber, then to critical red, as I relentlessly poured fire into the ceaseless green tide. The moment one power pack ran dry, I savagely slammed in a replacement and continued firing. When that too was depleted, I reached instinctively for another, only to find my ammunition pouch alarmingly empty. Sergeant Herrick, his gaze fixed unblinkingly on the advancing orcs, tossed me a spare power pack without a word. His face was a mask of grim, resolute concentration, an expression I had come to associate exclusively with veteran non-commissioned officers. Not precisely fear, but rather an absolute, chilling awareness of the direness of our situation, coupled with an unwavering determination to sell their lives as dearly as humanly possible. He had been fighting orcs for 15 grueling years, and he possessed an unvarnished understanding of the monstrous enemy we now faced. The initial wave of the orc "wag" broke against our steadfast defenses like a torrential tide against an unyielding stone, leaving hundreds of their grotesque corpses strewn across the brutal killing ground. Yet, like water, given sufficient time and relentless pressure, eventually wears away even the hardest stone. Their numbers, though diminished, were still overwhelming. The second wave struck an hour later, followed swiftly by the third, then the fourth. Each subsequent attack, while marginally smaller than the last, chipped away at our rapidly dwindling ammunition reserves and ceaselessly mounted our casualties. Simple, brutal arithmetic dictated that we would inevitably be overwhelmed before the sanctuary of nightfall. It was Colonel Vra who made the utterly brutal decision that, in a twisted sense, saved us. Though saved feels far too generous a term for the horrific events that immediately followed. He called down a devastating orbital bombardment directly onto our own forward positions, a calculated sacrifice of the outermost defensive lines designed to purchase precious time for a fighting withdrawal to the secondary perimeter. The ensuing bombardment annihilated the vast majority of the attacking orcs, but also claimed the lives of roughly half of our own remaining men. It was, by any cold, objective military measure, a brilliantly executed tactical decision. It was also, undeniably, the mass murder of Imperial soldiers perpetrated by Imperial command. I was inside the reinforced command bunker when the orbital bombardment commenced, and thus I survived the initial cataclysmic impact. The men manning the forward trenches, however, were afforded no such fortune. They were vaporized instantaneously, along with their orc attackers, by macro cannon shells raining down from orbit. One moment they were valiantly fighting for their lives. The next, they were mere superheated plasma, violently dispersed into the poisoned atmosphere. Clean, quick, efficient. The Emperor's mercy, as some, in their grim fatalism, sometimes called it. We fell back, a broken, desperate line, to the secondary perimeter under the pulverizing cover of the orbital fire, carrying our wounded and abandoning everything that was not absolutely essential to our immediate survival. The orcs, battered but not broken, were already regrouping for another relentless assault. But the bombardment had indeed bought us precious, agonizing time to consolidate our shattered defenses and redistribute our critically dwindling ammunition. It had also, perhaps, taught them a brutal lesson about the terrifying power of Imperial firepower, though whether that would render them more cautious or merely more savagely determined remained an ominous uncertainty. The second phase of the battle commenced that very evening as the dying sun bled behind vast, churning clouds of smoke and toxic vapor. This time, the orcs approached with an uncharacteristic, unsettling caution, utilizing the fresh rubble and gaping crater holes left by the orbital bombardment as improvised cover, advancing in short, brutal rushes rather than the mindless, headlong charges they had favored earlier. They were learning, adapting to our tactics with a terrifying speed, just as we, grimly, were adapting to theirs. In a galaxy perpetually consumed by war, even the most primitive species were forced to evolve or perish. We grimly held the secondary perimeter for 3 agonizing days. 3 days of unceasing, brutal fighting, punctuated by only the briefest, most fitful snatches of sleep between relentless assaults, and the slow, chilling realization that, this time, we were truly not going to survive. Our precious ammunition was all but depleted. Our heavy weapons were rapidly exhausting their power, and the orcs, with their grotesque, gleeful savagery, showed no discernible signs of losing interest in their blood-soaked game. Indeed, they were having far too much fun. The relentless onslaught seemed insurmountable, but our desperate struggle was not in vain. On the 4th day, salvation descended from the heavens in the formidable shape of a Space Marine strike force, warriors of the revered Iron Hands chapter. 3 colossal Thunderhawk gunships pierced the atmosphere, plummeting from orbit like divine avenging angels. Their formidable weapon systems unleashed barrages that meticulously carved devastating paths through the dense orc formations. Space Marines, clad in their iconic power armor, swiftly deployed from the gunship's assault ramps, their bolt rounds, explosive projectiles, effortlessly tearing through orc armor as if it were nothing more than flimsy paper. In less than an hour, the entire orc warband, WAG, was either utterly annihilated or sent scattering, retreating in disarray back into the unforgiving wastelands. We had paid a terrible price, losing 400 30 of our brave men. The Space Marines, by stark contrast, had suffered no casualties whatsoever. They extracted us from Karak Prime with swift, clinical efficiency, transferring us directly to a Navy transport vessel that would ferry us to our subsequent deployment. Before their departure, their imposing sergeant conveyed to Colonel Vra that our acceptable resistance had significantly aided in containing the immediate orc threat. This was undoubtedly an extraordinary commendation from the Adeptus Astartes, a brotherhood of demigods. Yet such high praise did little to diminish the cold, hard reality of our fallen comrades. It did not in any way make the dead any less dead. The arduous journey to our next deployment spanned a grueling 6 months. I spent the vast majority of this time confined to the ship's cramped medical bay, slowly recuperating from severe shrapnel wounds and an insidious condition the medics clinically termed combat stress reaction. This was the sterile, official designation for the psychological collapse a soldier experiences when their mind shatters under the unbearable, crushing weight of protracted warfare. Its harrowing symptoms manifested as relentless nightmares, debilitating, uncontrollable tremors, and an omnipresent paranoia that caused me to perceive enemies lurking in every fleeting shadow. The prescribed treatment was a stark, almost ironic regimen. Potent drugs, enforced, often restless, periods of rest, and stern, impassioned lectures on the virtues of duty and courage, delivered invariably by officers who, I suspected, had never endured the raw, visceral terror of genuine combat. Every single night throughout those 6 interminable months, I was plagued by vivid, horrifying dreams. They were always the same, fractured visions of Hethgard's toxic, gas-choked air, of Karak Prime's sky ablaze with infernal fire, and the spectral faces of all the lives I had taken, intertwined with the agonizing memories of friends I had watched perish. Faces without names, names without faces, and the constant chilling echo of distant laser fire. A relentless, percussive soundtrack to my torment. I would awaken drenched in sweat, my hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that was agonizingly absent, my voice hoarse from shouting futile warnings to comrades who had long since passed into oblivion. The medical officer, a weary, somber woman whose hair was prematurely streaked with gray, assured me with a detached professionalism that these nightmares would eventually diminish with the passage of time. She was profoundly mistaken. 14 years later, the spectral landscapes of Hethgard and Karak's Prime continue to haunt my sleep. I still jolt awake, my hand outstretched for a phantom rifle. The only discernible change is that I have mastered the art of suffering in stoic silence, forcing the screams of memory and trauma to remain contained deep within, where they truly belong. Our subsequent assignment led us to Talon, a stark desert world renowned throughout the Imperium for its formidable armored regiments and its ceaseless, brutal campaigns waged against unrelenting orc raiders, insidious chaos cultists, and on occasion, even other Imperial factions caught in the planet's perpetual maelstrom. We were officially attached to the 12th Talon Desert Raiders, serving as replacement personnel tasked with desperately patching the gaping holes in their ranks, grievous losses inflicted by the relentless attrition of previous deployments. We were initially informed that this was a distinct privilege, that the Talon regiments were nothing short of legendary, celebrated for their exceptional skill, unwavering courage, and an uncanny ability to snatch victory from the jaws of impossible odds. The harsh, unvarnished reality, however, presented a starkly different picture. The 12th Talon was, in essence, a shattered unit. Its depleted ranks were a grim mosaic of shell-shocked veterans, fresh-faced, utterly green recruits, and men who had been summarily deemed unfit for service within the more esteemed, prestigious formations of the Imperial Guard. They had been engaged in uninterrupted combat for a grueling 3 years, shunted between disparate combat zones without ever being granted the solace of returning to their distant homeworld. They were profoundly weary, deeply embittered, and held together solely by the unyielding, almost superhuman iron discipline of their officers and the grim, unspoken mutual understanding that desertion in this unforgiving theater meant certain agonizing death. Colonel Vra, our former commanding officer, was unceremoniously transferred to another unit, replaced by Major Saurus, a native Talon officer who had painstakingly forged his rank over 3 decades of relentless service in the planet's vast, desolate wastes. Major Saurus was, in every conceivable way, the polar opposite of Colonel Vra. He was volatile, unpredictable, prone to making impulsive decisions guided more by raw instinct than by careful, measured analysis. Yet remarkably, his men adored him for it. They also, tragically, died for it, often in staggering numbers that made our comparatively modest casualties on Karax Prime seem almost insignificant. Talon itself was an unforgiving realm of boundless, shifting sands, where scorching, furnace-like days abruptly yielded to freezing, desolate nights. The indigenous population, wise to the planet's perils, resided in sprawling underground cities, intricate networks of tunnels providing sanctuary, emerging onto the surface only when absolutely essential, always encased in heavy, specialized protective gear. The surface world was a crucible of death, home to titanic sandstorms capable of flaying flesh from bone, extreme temperature fluctuations that could claim an exposed human life in mere minutes, and monstrous creatures that had evolved to not just survive, but to thrive in conditions that would push even the most cutting-edge Imperial technology to its breaking point. We endured 2 grueling years on Talon, locked in relentless combat against a constantly shifting array of adversaries, who often seemed to materialize from the shimmering desert air like malevolent mirages. These included brutal orc raiders from the distant outer systems, fanatical chaos cultists who fervently worshipped the planet's cyclonic, endless storms, and, on occasion, even other beleaguered Imperial forces who, disoriented and lost in the trackless wastes, mistakenly perceived us as a threat. The desert itself remained a cold, impartial arbiter in these conflicts, dispatching everyone with an indiscriminate, relentless enthusiasm, utterly indifferent to their allegiances or the righteousness of their cause. During this time, I painstakingly learned to navigate by the unfamiliar constellations, to miraculously unearth precious water in seemingly utterly barren landscapes, and to achieve a semblance of sleep, even as sand perpetually gritty filled my eyes, mouth, and permeated every piece of my equipment. I discovered, through grim experience, which indigenous creatures were safe to consume and which ones would deliver a swift, agonizing death with a mere touch. I adapted to fighting in conditions where visibility was severely curtailed, often measured in mere meters, and where the only dependable landmarks were the smoldering, skeletal wrecks of vehicles that had succumbed to the fury of the latest sandstorm. Most crucially, I internalized the brutal truth that survival on Talon had little to do with raw strength, exceptional bravery, or even cunning intellect. Survival, above all else, was about sheer, unadulterated luck. And luck, I quickly understood, was a finite, precious resource that had to be meticulously hoarded and judiciously expended. Every sunrise I witnessed, every day I miraculously survived, brought me one agonizing step closer to the inevitable moment when my luck would finally, irrevocably run out. The only chilling uncertainty was whether that moment would arrive amidst the frenetic chaos of combat, trapped within the suffocating maw of a sandstorm, or during one of the interminable, brutal marches across the desolate, empty wasteland between one ephemeral objective and the next. The relentless fighting on Talon quickly settled into a grimly predictable, soul-crushing pattern. We would receive intelligence reports detailing purported enemy activity in a specific region, then embark on an arduous march across the treacherous desert to investigate, only to invariably discover that the intelligence was either hopelessly outdated, laughably inaccurate, or, most sinisterly, deliberately misleading. On occasion, we would indeed stumble upon the enemy, usually finding them in far greater numbers than anticipated and significantly better prepared than our meager briefings had ever dared to suggest. More often, however, our exhaustive searches yielded nothing but endless dunes of sand, oppressive heat, and the bleached bones of countless previous expeditions that had foolishly pursued the very same false leads. The most insidious aspect of this perpetual campaign, however, was the interminable waiting, long, agonizing stretches of enforced idleness when absolutely nothing happened, as we sat vigilantly in our static positions, our eyes straining against the horizon for any discernible sign of movement that agonizingly never materialized. The desolate desert itself became a cruel tormentor, playing insidious tricks on our minds, conjuring phantom shapes in the shimmering distance, whispering disembodied voices on the relentless wind, and fostering an omnipresent, chilling sensation that we were perpetually watched by unseen, insidious foes. Men who had stoically endured and survived pitched battles against overwhelming, impossible odds, would paradoxically unravel and succumb to the sheer psychological pressure of merely sitting in the sand for days on end, staring blankly into the vast, indifferent emptiness. I received my promotion to corporal during our second grueling year on Talon, an unwanted advancement that followed the tragic death of Sergeant Herrick in a brutal skirmish with fanatical chaos cultists. This new rank brought with it a heavy mantle of additional responsibilities, a negligible increase in pay, and the grim privilege of witnessing fresh-faced, younger soldiers inevitably commit the very same naive, costly mistakes I myself had made on the hellish landscapes of Hethgard and Carax Prime. More profoundly, it came with the chilling realization that I was now inextricably invested in the Imperium's brutal system, my obligations extending far beyond my own mere survival to encompass the very lives of those under my command. Leading men in the crucible of combat is a fundamentally different burden from fighting as a common soldier. As a simple trooper, one's sole preoccupation is to meticulously follow orders and, by whatever means necessary, stay alive. As a leader, however, the weight is immeasurable. You are compelled to issue orders that hopefully will preserve the lives of other human beings, making agonizing decisions that will directly impact their distant families, their fragile futures, and their very chances of witnessing another dawn. Each choice, no matter how seemingly minor, transmutes into a profound moral calculation. Every single mistake, every misjudgment, inevitably becomes someone else's indelible tragedy. Just 3 agonizing weeks after my promotion, I lost my first man. Trooper Marcus Kane, a mere 19 years old, hailed from a distant agri-world whose name I never bothered to learn, now lost to the annals of memory. He was cut down by a concealed sniper during what should have been a routine patrol, a single precise shot piercing his head as he innocently examined what appeared to be an abandoned supply cache. The cache, of course, was a meticulously laid trap. By the time we belatedly pinpointed the sniper's hidden position, he was long gone, vanished into the vastness of the desert, and Trooper Kane was already dead before his lifeless body even crumpled to the unforgiving sand. It was clean, quick, brutally efficient, just another anonymous casualty in humanity's endless, grinding war. I meticulously composed a letter to Kane's grieving parents, as mandated by Imperial regulations. In it, I solemnly informed them that their son had perished serving the glorious Emperor, that his sacrifice would be eternally remembered, and that he had faced his demise with exemplary courage and dignity. All of it, in a twisted official sense, was true. Yet all of it was also, fundamentally, utterly meaningless. Their beloved son was dead because I had dispatched him to investigate a suspicious object instead of exercising caution and calling for specialized explosive ordnance disposal. My decision, my indelible responsibility, my crushing guilt, a burden I would carry for the remainder of my life. After that initial agonizing letter, the grim task of writing them became a soul-numbing routine. I composed them for Trooper Vex, whose life was abruptly ended by an orc slug round during a sudden night ambush, for Trooper Morrison, who suffocated and perished when his vital breathing apparatus catastrophically failed amidst the swirling chaos of a ferocious sandstorm, for Trooper Kellyan, who was shot by a fanatical chaos cultist who, rather than face capture and interrogation, detonated an entire belt of grenades, taking both his life and ours with him. For dozens of others, whose specific names have mercifully faded from my conscious memory, but whose haunted faces continue to torment my dreams. Each subsequent letter rigidly adhered to the same sterile template: died serving the Emperor, sacrifice not forgotten, courage and dignity in the face of death. Through sheer brutal repetition, these once sacred words were stripped of all genuine meaning, becoming nothing more than another administrative chore to be mechanically completed between harrowing combat missions. But the grieving families, I knew, needed to hear them. They needed desperately to believe that their cherished loved ones had indeed perished for something grand and meaningful. And so, the act of lying to grieving parents became, disturbingly, just another essential part of a soldier's grim duty. Of all the myriad foes we confronted on Talon, the insidious chaos cultists proved to be, by far, the most terrifying and abhorrent. The orcs, while undeniably dangerous, were at least crudely predictable, their actions motivated by primal bloodlust and an insatiable desire for wanton violence. The cultists, however, were fundamentally human, which meant they possessed the chilling capacity for strategic thought, elaborate planning, and a perverse ability to anticipate and counter our tactics. Yet, they were also utterly irrevocably insane, driven by a fanatical religious fervor that impelled them to commit atrocities that defied both logic and the most fundamental tenets of human decency. Engaging them in combat felt akin to grappling with a waking nightmare made flesh. They weaponized the very desert against us, meticulously poisoning precious water sources, artfully concealing deadly traps in ostensibly secure locations, and maliciously disseminating virulent diseases through abandoned settlements. In their twisted cruelty, they transformed captured Imperial personnel into horrific living bombs, their minds utterly wiped, mere slaves programmed to detonate explosive devices upon encountering friendly forces. They would even sacrifice entire innocent communities in grotesque rituals, aiming to tear open the veil of reality and summon demons, nightmarish entities from the warp, existing solely to sow unimaginable pain and terror across the physical realm. I first bore witness to a demon during our 18th month of deployment on Talon. We were meticulously investigating unsettling reports of heightened cultist activity within a desolate, abandoned mining settlement, pursuing intelligence that, for a rare and terrifying change, proved to be entirely accurate. The cultists were indeed present, but they were accompanied by something else, something fundamentally anathema, a grotesque entity that simply should not have existed within any universe governed by rational physical laws. It bore a resemblance to a man. If men were 3 meters tall and composed entirely of swirling shadow and pure, malevolent hatred. It drifted through our carefully established defensive positions with an ethereal, smoky grace, utterly impervious to volleys of laser fire and explosive rounds, dismissing them as if they were nothing more than gentle summer breezes. When it made contact with a man, that unfortunate soul would emit a single piercing scream, then immediately collapse, his very life force visibly draining away in a matter of horrifying seconds. When it did speak, which was mercifully infrequent, its voice resonated with the discordant sound of shattering glass and the distant, ominous rumble of thunder. We eventually managed to kill it, though kill feels like an inadequate term for the desperate, exhausting act we performed. We simply poured an overwhelming, sustained torrent of concentrated firepower into its approximate, ever-shifting location until it became visibly unstable, its shadowy form losing cohesion and gradually dissipating, fading back into the hellish realm that had birthed it. The entire brutal engagement consumed 4 harrowing hours, cost us a devastating 37 men, and left the surviving troopers with indelible nightmares that would fester and torment them for years to come. Yet we had technically won, and in the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy of official Imperial reports, technical victories were all that ever truly mattered. The demon's unholy presence had left an indelible stain, thoroughly corrupting everything within a 5-kilometer radius. Indigenous plant life withered and perished with unnatural speed. Animals either fled in a desperate, panicked rout or mutated into savage, aggressive beasts. Even the very air itself felt thick and heavy, saturated with a palpable, malevolent energy. We received immediate orders to evacuate the entire blighted region and then coordinate a devastating orbital bombardment to utterly cleanse the area. 6 months later, the soil remained stubbornly sterile, incapable of supporting life. The water was still virulently toxic, and any sensitive equipment brought too close to the ground zero impact zone would inexplicably malfunction. That grim aftermath was the precise moment I truly, viscerally comprehended the true nature of our enemy. We weren't merely fighting orcs or rebels or even other alien species vying for the same meager resources. We were fighting the very fabric of the universe itself, desperately holding back primordial forces that sought to unravel and remake reality according to utterly alien principles. Principles that would systematically destroy everything human, everything rational, and everything decent. The Imperium, for all its undeniable flaws and brutal inefficiencies, was at its core sane. And in a galaxy that had undeniably descended into utter madness, sanity was, unequivocally, the most precious commodity of all. After 2 relentless years of continuous deployment, our shattered unit was finally rotated off Talon. Those 2 brutal years of unceasing sand, searing heat, and unending warfare had left us profoundly physically exhausted and deeply, irrevocably, mentally scarred. Yet we had, by the Imperium's unforgiving standards, fulfilled our duty. The regiment's grim casualty reports revealed an 87% turnover rate, a chilling statistic, meaning that fewer than 1 man in 10 had managed to survive the entirety of that brutal deployment. By the callous metrics of the Imperial Guard, such a devastating attrition rate was, astonishingly, deemed acceptable. Our subsequent assignment was to ship duty, where we would serve as security personnel aboard Imperial Navy vessels, tasked with patrolling the vast, often lawless, Outer Rim territories. The prospect sounded like an unimaginable vacation after the living hell of Talon, and in many respects, it truly was. We were afforded regular, nourishing meals, access to clean, potable water, and the luxury of sleeping quarters that were actually enclosed, providing a modicum of privacy and shelter. We also enjoyed the familiar comfort of regular gravity, recycled air that, miraculously, did not taste perpetually of sand, and the reassuring knowledge that the ship's formidable void shields would likely safeguard us from the majority of conventional enemy weapons. However, ship duty was also, paradoxically, mind-numbingly tedious. We would spend months at a time in the monotonous void, traveling between disparate star systems. Our limited responsibilities were typically restricted to guard duty, routine weapons maintenance, and the rare adrenaline-spiking occasional boarding action when we intercepted suspicious vessels. The vast majority of our time was consumed by enforced idleness, a purgatory of reading tattered old books, playing endless rounds of cards, and desperately trying to suppress the ever-present, gnawing dread of what horrific fate might await us at our next destination. The Imperial Navy, I quickly observed, operated under a fundamentally different set of principles than the Imperial Guard. Navy personnel were highly specialized professionals, meticulously trained for specific, intricate technical roles, and were expected to serve for decades, a stark contrast to the fleeting few years that most guardsmen could realistically hope to survive. They often regarded us with a thinly veiled disdain, seeing us as necessary but temporary passengers, essential only for certain specialized ground operations, and certainly not truly an integral part of their ship's dedicated crew. The sentiment, I must confess, was entirely mutual. They waged their vast impersonal battles from unimaginable distances, leveraging advanced technology and complex tactics that we as ground pounders could barely begin to comprehend. We, by ingrained habit and grim experience, preferred our enemies close enough to discern the raw terror or the fanatical devotion in their faces. During my protracted tour of naval duty, I served aboard 3 distinct Imperial warships. First, the Righteous Fury, a majestic grand cruiser that vigilantly patrolled the vital shipping lanes connecting the Imperium's sprawling, monumental hive worlds. Next, the Emperor's Wrath, a formidable battlecruiser relentlessly engaged in hunting down dangerous pirates across the treacherous Outer Rim systems. And finally, the Divine Providence, a colossal battleship that proudly bore the esteemed mantle of flagship for the entire Battlefleet Obscurus. Each of these magnificent vessels possessed its own unique culture, its deeply ingrained traditions, and its distinct, often idiosyncratic, methods for contending with the mind-numbing, isolating boredom inherent in prolonged space travel. The singular, most haunting action I experienced throughout my entire naval service transpired aboard the Emperor's Wrath, when we successfully intercepted an insidious Chaos Raider that had been mercilessly preying upon vulnerable Imperial merchant vessels. The Raider itself was a grotesquely converted Imperial frigate, its once proud hull now defiled and encrusted with blasphemous, writhing symbols, crewed by depraved humans who had willingly bartered their very souls for fleeting power and access to forbidden, sanity-shattering knowledge. They fought with the desperate, suicidal fury of the truly damned, understanding implicitly that capture guaranteed immediate, brutal execution, and that perhaps a swift death at our hands might even be a merciful reprieve from the unspeakable torments their dark masters would inflict upon them for failure. We ultimately boarded the Twisted Raider after a brutal, protracted void battle that left both our formidable battlecruiser and their corrupted frigate crippled and helplessly adrift in the silent, star-dusted void. The boarding action had been meticulously planned as a routine operation. Secure the enemy vessel, capture any surviving crew for rigorous interrogation, and salvage whatever valuable intelligence we could unearth. Yet, from the moment we breached its hull, absolutely nothing about it was routine. The interior of that horrific chaos vessel had been utterly warped, transformed into an unspeakable labyrinth that barely qualified as architecture in any recognizable sense. Corridors twisted and converged in directions that seemed to defy all laws of physics and geometry, causing a physical ache just to mentally trace their path. The very walls were alive, crawling with blasphemous, shifting symbols that appeared to subtly writhe and pulsate when directly observed, and the stagnant, oppressive air itself hung heavy with disembodied whispers, insidious murmurs in languages that predated the very dawn of human speech. Traversing those distorted passages felt precisely like navigating the inner workings of a feverish, living nightmare, and several of our veteran men, their resolve finally breaking, simply refused to advance further. Beyond the first few grotesquely reconfigured compartments, we finally located the entire crew in what had once been the ship's majestic cathedral, now desecrated and transformed into a vile, reeking shrine dedicated to malevolent powers that, for sanity's sake, shall remain eternally nameless. They had been dead for hours, having, it seemed, taken their own lives in some final, abhorrent ritual, their bodies meticulously arranged in sickening, intricate patterns that brought involuntary tears to my eyes merely to behold. The pervasive stench was utterly indescribable, not merely the cloying odor of death and decay, but something profoundly more sinister, a miasma that hinted at a level of spiritual corruption that transcended mere physical decomposition. The ship's intricate cogitator systems had been infected with something unspeakable, twisting their benevolent machine spirits into gibbering digital madmen. Every single screen glowed with impossible, sanity-bending geometries. Every speaker blared with an infernal cacophony of screaming that originated from no human throat. And every automated system seemed diabolically designed to inflict maximum psychological trauma upon any unfortunate soul foolish enough to attempt interaction. We were ultimately forced to sever all power to the entire blighted vessel, a desperate measure taken simply to silence the relentless electronic cacophony that threatened to shatter our very minds. What we painstakingly unearthed within the captain's grotesquely defiled quarters fundamentally shattered and reshaped my entire understanding of what the true enemy actually was. We discovered meticulously detailed maps delineating vital Imperial shipping routes, precise patrol schedules, and the exact locations of defensive positions. Communication logs laid bare extensive contacts with other Chaos vessels, intricate coordination of devastating attacks, and disturbing intelligence illicitly gathered from compromised sources deep within the very heart of the Imperium itself. Most profoundly disturbing of all, we found comprehensive personnel files on various Imperial Guard units, complete with incisive tactical assessments, chilling psychological profiles of their commanders and key personnel, and even specific recommendations on precisely how best to systematically break their morale. They had been studying us, patiently and meticulously dissecting our methods, exploiting our inherent weaknesses, and preying upon our deepest, most primal fears. The forces of chaos, I now understood with a cold dread, were not merely mindless destroyers driven solely by unbridled bloodlust and frothing madness. They were terrifyingly organized, chillingly methodical, and utterly, irrevocably committed to the complete annihilation of every single principle and institution we held sacred. They comprehended us, the loyal servants of the Emperor, far better than we understood ourselves, and they were relentlessly employing that intimate knowledge to systematically dismantle the Imperium from within, piece by agonizing piece. I endured 6 agonizing hours aboard that cursed vessel, meticulously searching through compartments that stubbornly defied all known geometry and examining artifacts that, by any sane reckoning, should never have been brought into existence. 6 hours that, in the warped reality of that place, felt like 6 interminable years, utterly subsumed by overwhelming evidence of humanity's seemingly boundless capacity for corruption and the galaxy's insatiable, infinite appetite for suffering. By the time we finally withdrew to the relative sanity and safety of our own ship, a chilling clarity had settled upon me. I now profoundly understood why the Imperium's official, uncompromising policy towards chaos was one of immediate and total annihilation. Some knowledge, I realized, was simply too perilous to preserve. Some enemies far too corrupting, too insidious to ever be captured alive. The Emperor's wrath subsequently obliterated the raider with a volley of potent melter torpedoes, fired at terrifying point-blank range. The resulting explosion was a brief, blinding miniature star, visible for light minutes in every direction, utterly consuming both the twisted vessel and every trace of its vile contents. The captain, in his official log, simply recorded it as a successful interdiction operation. The sterile, official records, predictably, made no mention whatsoever of the unspeakable horrors we had encountered, the chilling truths we had painstakingly unearthed, or why, within a mere week of our return to port, fully half of the boarding party had frantically requested transfers to entirely different units. My tenure in naval service eventually concluded when the majestic Divine Providence was reassigned to the distant, war-torn Gothic sector, and my regiment received orders transferring us back to ground operations, specifically within the strategically vital Segmentum Solar. I had served aboard various Imperial warships for a total of 18 months, participated in 7 perilous boarding actions, and remarkably, survived 3 major void battles against impossible odds. This profound experience had fundamentally reshaped my worldview, teaching me that the galaxy was far vaster, far more treacherous, and infinitely more dangerous than I had ever dared to imagine. It had revealed that humanity's myriad enemies manifested in forms that profoundly challenged both logic and the very limits of sanity. Furthermore, it had instilled in me the grim, inescapable truth that the war we were relentlessly fighting could not, in any conventional sense, ever truly be won. Victory, I realized, was not about grand conquest or the complete eradication of our seemingly endless foes. Victory was simply the act of continuing to exist, of desperately maintaining the fragile, thin line between the precarious bastion of civilization and the encroaching, ravenous abyss of chaos for just another day, another arduous year, another struggling generation. We were not heroes in any romantic, idealized sense of the word. Rather, we were the grim, tireless antibodies within the galaxy's vast, failing immune system, relentlessly fighting an insidious, pervasive infection that, we knew, could never be completely, truly cured. Our subsequent assignment brought us full circle back to ground operations on Moria itself, the very same industrial world where, almost a decade prior, I had been summarily conscripted as a raw recruit. The planet, I observed with a pang of bitter familiarity, had undergone a chilling metamorphosis in my prolonged absence. It had been transformed from a relatively prosperous, bustling manufacturing center into a formidable fortress world, now grimly preparing for an inevitable, cataclysmic siege. The skies above were choked with countless orbital defense platforms, bristling with weaponry. Vast networks of underground bunkers extended for kilometers, burrowing deep into the planet's very core, and every single able-bodied citizen between the ages of 16 and 60 had been forcibly conscripted into the planetary defense forces. The looming threat was a catastrophic orc invasion, a colossal spearheaded by a monstrous war boss known only as Scarjaw, the Despoiler. Intelligence estimates grimly suggested that over 2 million orcs were already massing in nearby star systems, accompanied by their usual chaotic collection of sniveling grots, feral squigs, and ramshackle, yet terrifyingly effective war machines. The full-scale invasion was anticipated within 6 months, and preparations were proceeding with the grim, ruthless efficiency that has always characterized Imperial military planning. I found myself assigned to the 15th Morian Shock Troops, an elite formation specifically tasked with the defense of the primary hive city's vast industrial district. The bitter irony of this situation was certainly not lost on me. I had departed Moria as a freshly recruited, naive civilian, only to return as a battle-hardened veteran soldier, now charged with defending the very same factories where I had once toiled as a child laborer. The capricious wheel of fate, it seemed, possessed a particularly cruel and dark sense of humor. The planet-wide preparations for the impending siege warfare were both exhaustively comprehensive and utterly soul-crushing. Immediate food rationing was implemented to meticulously stretch dwindling supplies for what could be an indefinite, harrowing period. Entire civilian populations were grimly relocated to vast underground shelters, which had been pre-stocked with an arsenal of weapons, ammunition, and detailed instructions for desperate urban guerrilla warfare. Every critical industrial facility was meticulously rigged with powerful demolition charges, ensuring their utter destruction to deny them to the enemy. Every street corner was transformed into a formidable fortified position. Every building was systematically converted into a potential strong point, a bastion for a desperate last stand. And every single citizen, regardless of age or prior experience, was subjected to rudimentary military training. The sight of the children, however, was by far the most heartbreaking aspect. I watched with a heavy heart 10-year-old boys diligently learning to field strip powerful laser guns, 12-year-old girls practicing grenade-throwing techniques with unsettling precision, and teenagers, barely old enough to sprout facial hair, being instructed in the grim art of constructing improvised explosive devices. They approached their grim training with the same innocent, unbridled enthusiasm that children on more fortunate, peaceful worlds might exhibit for games or sports. War was simply all that they knew, all they had ever known, and they accepted its brutal realities as the unquestioned, natural order of their existence. I unexpectedly found myself assigned to grim training duties, tasked with impartially passing on hard-won, often bloody, knowledge to raw recruits who might, by some miracle, live long enough to actually utilize it. I taught these young, impressionable soldiers the critical skills of digging proper foxholes, how to meticulously maintain their vital equipment under the most punishing combat conditions, and how to keenly recognize the subtle, insidious signs of enemy infiltration. Most crucially, I taught them how to die well, how to sell their precious lives for maximum tactical advantage, how to inflict the greatest cost upon the enemy, when the grim reality dictated that survival was no longer a viable option. The lessons I imparted were relentlessly practical, devoid of any pretense of inspiration or heroic rhetoric. They encompassed critical skills, how to precisely distinguish between different types of incoming enemy fire merely by sound, which horrific wounds could be hastily treated in the field to buy precious time, and which ones unequivocally demanded immediate, desperate evacuation. How to force oneself to continue fighting with broken bones, debilitating internal bleeding, and the kinds of grievous injuries that would instantly incapacitate or kill a less hardened civilian. And, perhaps most profoundly, how to paradoxically make a grim peace with the inevitability of death without ever surrendering one's burning will to live. The recruits, despite the grim future awaiting them, were eager, enthusiastic, and to my experienced eyes, tragically doomed. I could plainly discern it in their bright, yet ultimately naive eyes, the very same bright-eyed confidence that I myself had once possessed, the same fervent belief that rigorous training and unyielding determination would somehow be sufficient to see them through the coming maelstrom. They had not yet learned the brutal, fundamental truth that war was not some grand test to be passed, or a noble challenge to be heroically overcome. War was entropy given a terrifying physical form, chaos made manifest. It was the universe's cruel, relentless way of reminding humanity that its very survival was never, ever guaranteed. True to their unpredictable nature, the orcs arrived far ahead of schedule, as orcs always seem to do. Their advanced scouts, mere harbingers of the approaching doom, materialized in the outer system a full 3 months before our intelligence estimates had predicted, signaling the imminent arrival of the main invasion force. As anticipated, with the main fleet arriving mere days later. The invasion commenced with devastating orbital bombardments, transforming entire city districts into smoking, desolate craters. This apocalyptic prelude was swiftly followed by brutal drop-pod assaults, which slammed orc forces directly into our prepared defensive lines. Yet, this was no typical, chaotic green tide. This was a calculated onslaught. Scarjaw the Despoiler, clearly having learned bitter lessons from past defeats, had meticulously integrated captured Imperial tactics into his own battle plans. He displayed an alarming level of strategic acumen, making him infinitely more formidable than any ordinary war boss. His forces executed precision strikes against our vital communication centers, critical supply depots, and hardened command bunkers, with an accuracy that unmistakably pointed to extensive reconnaissance and meticulous, detailed planning. The initial wave slammed into our sector at dawn on a Tuesday. Hundreds of orc assault troops, their advance bolstered by crude yet surprisingly effective artillery, descended upon our fortified positions like an unstoppable green avalanche. They burst screaming from the smoke, brandishing rudimentary weapons and clad in primitive armor. Yet their sheer overwhelming numbers and their utterly mindless courage rendered them nearly unstoppable. We stubbornly held our ground for 6 grueling hours, pouring disciplined, relentless fire into the surging orc ranks and calling down precision artillery strikes onto their exposed assembly areas. Our defensive works, meticulously constructed, offered optimal fields of fire, and our ammunition supplies were more than adequate for a prolonged engagement. Indeed, by every accepted measure of military science, we should have been able to repel this attack with only acceptable casualties. What we had failed to fully account for, however, was the orcs' utter, complete indifference to casualties. They kept surging forward, a relentless tide. Despite sustaining losses that would have shattered any sane species, clambering over the mangled bodies of their fallen comrades to reach our firing positions. When their crude weapons inevitably jammed or ran dry of ammunition, they simply drew massive choppers and crude pistols. And when even those failed, they resorted to their bare hands and filed, sharpened teeth. Nothing, it seemed, could stop them except death itself. And sometimes, unsettlingly, not even that. During that initial, brutal engagement, I personally emptied 4 power packs, unleashing controlled bursts at targets that impossibly seemed to multiply even as I desperately watched. My trusty laser gun grew so intensely hot that its barrel began to visibly warp, forcing me to reluctantly switch to my sidearm once my primary weapon became utterly unusable. Still, the orcs kept advancing, striding through the merciless, withering fire as if it were nothing more than a gentle rain. Their crude features twisted into grotesque expressions of savage, unholy joy. The inevitable breakthrough materialized at our western flank, where a highly concentrated orc assault brutally overwhelmed a critical weak point in our otherwise formidable defensive line. Hundreds of those green-skinned killers immediately poured through the gaping breach, mercilessly attacking our positions from behind, while their comrades maintained their relentless frontal assault. We found ourselves tragically caught between two relentless fires, desperately battling enemies who appeared to surge from every direction at once. The grim order to fall back, when it finally came, arrived far too late to save the vast majority of the 15th Shock Troops. We suffered a staggering 70% loss of our fighting strength on that brutal first day, with countless comrades killed or gravely wounded during the chaotic, desperate retreat through streets choked with rubble and terrified civilian refugees. Those of us fortunate enough to survive regrouped at hastily established secondary positions, integrated with other fragmented and broken units, and grimly prepared ourselves for the inevitable next assault. During this grim reorganization, I found myself promoted to sergeant, not for any particular act of heroism, but simply because all the pre-existing sergeants were quite plainly dead. In besieged cities, command positions changed hands with shocking frequency, filled by whoever remained alive and competent enough to issue orders that still made some semblance of tactical sense. Leadership had ceased to be a matter of qualification. It had become solely a matter of survival. And that survival was, increasingly, a cruel twist of luck. The brutal siege of Moria dragged on for 8 agonizing months. 8 months of incessant, grinding warfare, punctuated only by brief, deceptive periods of relative quiet between each wave of assaults. Slowly, inexorably, the grim realization dawned upon us. We were not going to win. The Orcs maintained complete control of the orbital space around the planet, effectively severing any hope of resupply or vital reinforcement from the wider Imperium. Our precious ammunition was dwindling dangerously low. Our meager food supplies were nearly exhausted, and our casualty rates had long become utterly unsustainable. But the Orcs, disturbingly, were also learning and evolving, adapting to our tactics with the same grim determination that we were adapting to theirs. They began to deploy captured Imperial equipment, integrating human weapons and even vehicles into their crude, ramshackle war machines. Worse still, they were utilizing captured humans as advisors, treacherous turncoats who willingly provided invaluable intelligence about our defensive positions and tactical procedures. This war was a crucible, fundamentally changing both sides, forcing an accelerated evolution that neither species had ever truly anticipated. The inevitable breaking point arrived during the 6th month of the siege, when overwhelming Orc forces finally penetrated the primary hive's lower levels and began ferociously fighting their way toward the industrial core. Should they reach the main power generators, we knew the entire defensive grid would catastrophically collapse, rendering any organized resistance utterly impossible. We immediately received grim orders to hold the generator complex at all costs, a stark military terminology that unmistakably meant we were expected to die, fighting to the last, precisely where we stood. The final desperate battle for Moria lasted 3 agonizing days. 3 days of brutal, claustrophobic fighting in confined spaces, utilizing whatever improvised weapons and salvaged equipment we could muster. We were even supported by valiant civilians who had voluntarily chosen to fight alongside us rather than face the horrific fate of capture. The Orcs attacked in relentless waves, each successive wave perhaps smaller than the last, but undeniably more desperate, more vicious, and far more grimly determined to achieve victory regardless of the colossal cost. They had, after all, invested far too much blood and effort in this protracted siege to ever countenance defeat. At one point, I recall killing my very last Orc with a combat knife, repeatedly plunging the blade into the creature's massive chest until its crude, powerful heart finally ceased its brutal beating. My lasgun was utterly empty. My sidearm was broken beyond repair, and my ammunition pouches contained nothing but empty power packs and spent shell casings. The orc, a hulking brute, was undoubtedly larger than me, far stronger, and armed with a weapon that could have effortlessly cleaved me in half with a single, devastating blow. But I was faster, and in the claustrophobic, confined spaces where we fought, speed was the only thing that truly mattered. The orc perished with what might have been interpreted as a smile twisting across its brutal, green features. Even in death, it appeared to be enjoying itself, seemingly pleased by the formidable quality of opposition it had so fiercely encountered. There was something almost perversely admirable about its raw, unfiltered attitude, a pure, unvarnished honesty that human soldiers rarely, if ever, displayed. It had come solely to fight. It had fought exceptionally well, and it had died precisely as it had lived. In its own brutal, honest way, it was perhaps more genuine than any of us. Relief, in its purest, most overwhelming form, finally arrived on the morning of the fourth day. Space Marine Strike Forces, drawn from the renowned Imperial Fist chapter, executed a flawless planetfall and immediately began systematically eliminating entrenched orc positions across the city. Their sudden, devastating arrival dramatically turned the tide of battle in a mere matter of hours, compelling the surviving orcs to either initiate a full retreat or face utter annihilation by enemies they simply could not hope to defeat. Within a single week, all organized orc resistance had utterly collapsed, and the protracted siege of Moria was officially declared over. Yet the cost was horrific. We had lost a staggering 92% of our fighting strength during the siege. Out of nearly 50,000 valiant defenders who had stood ready when the orcs first descended, fewer than 4,000 survived to witness our hard-won liberation. The city itself lay in utter ruins, its once thriving industrial capacity completely destroyed, its civilian population tragically reduced to a mere fraction of its pre-war levels. By any objective measure, despite the formal declaration, it was undeniably a catastrophic defeat, cunningly disguised as a strategic victory. I was subsequently awarded the Medallion Crimson for exceptional valor displayed under the most extreme circumstances, a decoration that, in practical terms, came with a modest pension increase and the rather hollow right to wear a small piece of colored metal on my dress uniform. The official citation effusively praised my unwavering dedication to duty and my inspirational leadership during what it termed the darkest hours of the siege. It made absolutely no mention, however, of the countless men who had perished under my command, the innocent civilians I had been utterly unable to protect, or the haunting, vivid nightmares that would undoubtedly plague my sleep for years, perhaps decades afterward. The few survivors of the Moria siege were swiftly transferred to various units, scattered across the vast expanse of the galaxy, tasked with filling the gaping voids in formations that had endured their own catastrophic losses. I, personally, found myself assigned to the 23rd Cadian Shock Troops, an elite formation renowned throughout the Imperium for its iron discipline, unwavering professionalism, and an unusually, almost miraculously, high survival rate. This posting was officially presented as a reward for distinguished service, though by then I had long since learned to regard anything the military classified as a reward with deep suspicion. Cadia, as all know, was the quintessential fortress world, humanity's eternal vigil against the encroaching forces of chaos, forever guarding the dreaded Eye of Terror. The entire planet was, in essence, one colossal military base, its populace consisting exclusively of soldiers, essential support personnel, and the families who dutifully served both. Every single citizen was a soldier from the moment of their birth, rigorously trained to fight before they could even properly walk. Indoctrinated with advanced tactical knowledge and strategic thinking as thoroughly as other worlds taught basic literacy. The Cadians, truly, were professional soldiers in a way that precious few other regiments in the vast Imperium could ever truthfully claim. They engaged in battle with disciplined, almost surgical precision, relying on meticulous tactics rather than mere desperate courage or raw determination to achieve their objectives. Crucially, they were also supreme survivors, hardened veterans forged in countless campaigns, who had mastered the delicate balance between aggression and caution, courage and pragmatic common sense. They accepted me not just as another soldier, but as a fellow professional, someone who had demonstrably earned his rank through sheer competence rather than dubious political connections. My new commanding officer was Colonel Jarek Kane, a formidable Cadian officer who had been locked in brutal combat with the forces of chaos for over 20 relentless years. He was a lean, intense man with prematurely graying hair and piercing eyes that seemed to miss absolutely nothing. His soldiers respected him profoundly, not merely because of his rank, but primarily because of his uncanny, almost miraculous ability to guide them through seemingly impossible situations with surprisingly minimal casualties. In a profession where survival was the singular, ultimate measure of success, such an ability made him nothing short of legendary. Colonel Kane, I quickly learned, was a firm believer in meticulous, thorough preparation, precise and detailed intelligence, and the implementation of highly flexible tactics that allowed for rapid, decisive adaptation to ever-changing battlefield circumstances. Crucially, he also deeply believed in the paramount importance of caring for his men, ensuring they were always properly equipped, adequately rested, and thoroughly, unambiguously briefed on their specific objectives. This philosophy represented a truly refreshing and welcome change from the more common breed of commanders who routinely treated their soldiers as mere expendable resources rather than invaluable, highly trained assets. Our inaugural mission together was a reconnaissance operation deep within the Agrianar sector, tasked with investigating disturbing reports of unusual chaos activity near the ominous Thraxian Nebula. Initial intelligence vaguely suggested that heretic forces might be utilizing the nebula as a clandestine base for predatory raids against vital Imperial shipping lanes, but the specific details were unsettlingly vague, and the source of the information was highly questionable. It was, in short, precisely the kind of perilous mission that all too often concluded with entire companies vanishing without a trace or explanation. The journey to the foreboding Thraxian Nebula spanned 2 arduous months. Aboard the transport vessel Stalwart Defender, a converted merchant ship that had been hastily outfitted with basic military accommodations. While the conditions were undeniably cramped, they proved adequate for our needs, and the ship's seasoned crew was competent enough to safely navigate us through the treacherous currents of the warp. More importantly, their extensive experience with military passengers meant they largely left us to our own devices, allowing us to intensely focus on crucial mission preparation and meticulous equipment maintenance. Colonel Kane skillfully utilized the entire journey to conduct intensive training exercises, meticulously refining our tactical procedures and rigorously ensuring that every single man knew his precise role within the myriad contingencies we might potentially face. These exercises were not only exceptionally realistic, deeply demanding, and highly educational, but they also served a vital secondary purpose: to powerfully weld the disparate elements of our regiment into a truly cohesive and formidable fighting force, an outcome absolutely essential given the widely varied backgrounds of our personnel. The Thraxian Nebula itself was a truly perilous region of space, a maelstrom where the very laws of physical reality seemed to bend and operate under utterly alien principles. Gravity fluctuated wildly and unpredictably. Electromagnetic radiation charted impossible, twisting trajectories, and the precarious boundary between real space and the warp was thinner here than anywhere else in the entire sector. Tales were common of ships vanishing without a trace while attempting to traverse the nebula, only to inexplicably reappear years, sometimes decades later, their crews either aged decades beyond their time or driven screaming mad by unfathomable experiences that defied all human language and comprehension. We eventually made planetfall on Thrax Prime, a desolate world that had been abandoned by the Imperium nearly a century prior, when its local star began exhibiting ominous signs of terminal instability. The planet's surface was a chilling wasteland of crystallized atmosphere and vast, frozen oceans bathed in the sickly, anemic light of a dying sun. The only discernible signs of life were the pervasive chaos forces that had brazenly established bases within the crumbling ruins of the old Imperial cities, eagerly feeding off the dark, corrupting energies that permeated the entire system. The reconnaissance mission was initially projected to last a mere 6 weeks. Our directives were straightforward. Establish a covert observation post, meticulously gather critical intelligence on enemy strength and intentions, and then discreetly withdraw long before our presence could be detected. It was a seemingly simple, routine operation, precisely the kind that experienced soldiers could typically execute with minimal significant casualties. Yet, with horrifying inevitability, everything that possibly could go wrong did go spectacularly wrong within the very first week. The chaos forces we encountered were far from mere disorganized raiders or scattered cultists operating without central coordination. They were, instead, a highly disciplined military formation, spearheaded by a brutal Chaos Space Marine warband equipped with illicitly obtained Imperial technology and heavily supported by human auxiliary forces who had been irrevocably corrupted by decades of relentless exposure to the insidious warp energies. They not only knew we were coming, but had meticulously prepared advanced defenses specifically designed to counter our exact tactics, and were skillfully exploiting the nebula's unusual, reality-bending properties to mask their true, formidable strength. Tragically, we walked directly into a devastating ambush mere 3 days after our planetfall. The enemy had expertly utilized the treacherous frozen terrain to ingeniously conceal their meticulously prepared positions, enabling them to engage us from multiple directions simultaneously while remaining completely invisible to our most advanced reconnaissance equipment. We lost half of our advanced guard in that horrifying first volley alone, cut down by insidious weapons that fired ammunition infused with raw warp energy, projectiles that utterly ignored conventional armor and inflicted grievous, unnatural wounds that simply refused to heal properly. The brutal, desperate fighting retreat that immediately followed tested every single skill I had painfully acquired during my 14 long years of military service. We were hopelessly outnumbered, severely outgunned, and forced to operate in treacherous terrain that overwhelmingly favored the entrenched defenders. Our sole remaining advantage lay in our superior training and the kind of disciplined, precise fire control that could only be honed through years of fighting against impossible odds. We grimly leveraged that slim advantage to successfully break contact, withdraw to a more defensible position, and desperately call for immediate extraction. But the promised extraction never materialized. The transport ship that was meant to retrieve us had inexplicably vanished during a routine patrol, along with its vital escort vessels, and indeed, the entire task force that had brought us into this accursed system. We were now utterly stranded on a dying world, surrounded by relentless enemies who, we grimly understood, desired to capture us alive for reasons that were undoubtedly far worse than death. Completely cut off from any possibility of reinforcement or resupply, our situation was dire. In this moment of utter despair, Colonel Kane made the audacious decision that, against all odds, ultimately saved us. Though salvation is perhaps too generous a term for the harrowing ordeal that ensued. He ordered a relentless fighting advance directly toward the planet's primary spaceport, gambling everything on the desperate hope that we could capture an enemy vessel and somehow escape the system before our dwindling luck completely ran out. It was a desperate, almost suicidal plan with truly minimal chances of success. But at that point, desperation was literally all we had left to cling to. The arduous march to the spaceport stretched into 10 grueling days. 10 days of continuous, brutal skirmishing with ubiquitous enemy forces that seemed to eerily anticipate our every single move. They ceaselessly harassed us, but cunningly never committed to a full, decisive engagement, seemingly content to slowly wear us down through relentless attrition while we grimly struggled toward an objective that realistically might not even be reachable. It was psychological warfare at its most sophisticated and insidious, masterfully designed to utterly break our collective will long before it could ever physically break our bodies. We finally reached the spaceport, with fewer than 200 weary men remaining, a stark reduction to roughly half of our original strength. The facility was indeed defended, but surprisingly not as heavily as our initial dire intelligence reports had suggested. The enemy, it became clear, had concentrated their primary forces elsewhere, apparently brimming with confidence that we would, by all accounts, never make it this far. Their confidence was, perhaps understandable, but ultimately disastrously misplaced. For desperation, as history repeatedly proves, often makes men capable of achieving things that would be considered utterly impossible under normal circumstances. The final desperate assault on the spaceport lasted 6 brutal hours. 6 hours of savage close-quarters fighting within confined spaces, employing tactics that, by all rational standards, bordered on suicidal, yet somehow miraculously achieved their desperate objectives. Through sheer grit and ferocity, we managed to capture 3 enemy vessels, effectively killing or driving off the remaining defending forces. Within the captured facilities, we uncovered a cache of vital intelligence that chillingly explained everything we had experienced since our ill-fated arrival in the system. The Chaos Forces, it turned out, were not merely using the nebula as a base for random, opportunistic raids. Instead, they were meticulously preparing for a massive, full-scale offensive against the critical Cadian Gate, systematically massing an overwhelming strength for an assault that threatened to engulf and shatter the entire sector. Our reconnaissance mission, through sheer terrible luck, had inadvertently uncovered the preliminary yet critical stages of what could very well become the largest chaos invasion in centuries. This newfound information was far too vital to risk losing, even if transmitting it meant inevitably revealing our exact position to every single enemy force currently operating within the system. Without hesitation, we transmitted the critical intelligence data and immediately prepared for an urgent departure, knowing full well that overwhelming enemy reinforcements would undoubtedly converge upon our position within mere hours. The captured vessels, while crude and aesthetically displeasing, were thankfully functional, despite their machine spirits having been irrevocably corrupted by insidious chaos influence. They were, however, still capable of performing basic operational functions. Getting these tainted ships fully operational required a level of arcane technical skill that most of us sorely lacked, coupled with a desperate willingness to interact with technology that had been fundamentally tainted by forces that, by all cosmic laws, should simply not exist. The ensuing escape from Thrax Prime was an absolute nightmare of frantic void combat, as we were relentlessly pursued by enemy vessels that seemed to utterly ignore the normal limitations of physics. Our own ships were demonstrably slower, significantly less maneuverable, and cruelly crewed by soldiers who had absolutely no proper naval training whatsoever. By all reasonable expectations, we should have been utterly destroyed within minutes of leaving the planet's atmosphere. Instead, by some miracle, we somehow managed to reach the system's precarious edge and violently plunge into the swirling currents of the warp. Whether our astonishing escape was ultimately due to our meager skill, sheer, improbable luck, or the unfathomable intervention of powers we could never hope to understand, remains to this day profoundly unclear. The harrowing journey back to Imperial space consumed another 4 long months, most of which I spent confined within the ship's sterile medical bay, desperately attempting to recover from grievous wounds that stubbornly refused to heal properly. The insidious weapons wielded by chaos forces left behind horrific injuries that festered relentlessly despite every medical treatment, spreading virulent infections through both flesh and, disturbingly, spirit. Even the ship's medic, a grizzled veteran of 30 years' service, openly admitted that he had never, in his entire career, witnessed anything quite like them. During those 4 months of enforced recovery, I had ample, often unwelcome, time to reflect upon everything I had experienced since first leaving the dusty recruiting station on Moria. 14 relentless years of continuous warfare, dozens of brutal campaigns, hundreds of savage battles, and literally thousands of individual moments where survival had been agonizingly measured in mere seconds rather than hours. I had served on 16 different worlds, fought against 11 distinct types of enemy, and witnessed more men die than I could ever hope to count. What, I pondered, had I truly accomplished? What, for that matter, had any of us accomplished? The galaxy remained, eternally at war. The Imperium was still relentlessly besieged by enemies that multiplied faster than they could possibly be destroyed. And humanity, against all odds, was still clinging to a precarious existence through a desperate combination of brutal necessity and blind, unyielding faith. Nothing, it seemed, had fundamentally changed, save for the names listed on the endless casualty reports and the grim coordinates of the countless worlds where young men continued to go to their deaths. But perhaps, I began to muse, that was in itself enough. Perhaps the simple, agonizing act of bearing witness, of merely surviving long enough to remember, was its own profound form of victory, Someone, after all, had to carry the memory of all those who had fallen. Someone had to remember their names, their faces, and the agonizing ways they had died. If that truly was my ultimate purpose, if that was the bitter lesson my 14 years of service had relentlessly taught me, then perhaps, just perhaps, it was indeed worth the immense personal cost. The transport vessel that carried us, finally, back to Cadia, was met by an impressive flotilla of naval vessels that grandly escorted us to the legendary fortress world with full honors, deemed appropriate to our extraordinary achievement. We had, after all, gathered critical intelligence that would undoubtedly save millions of innocent lives, averted a catastrophic chaos offensive that could have utterly shattered the Imperial defenses across the sector, and demonstrated the kind of unwavering courage under impossible circumstances that cemented the Imperial Guard's legendary status. Officially, we were hailed as heroes, though heroes was certainly not how any of us truly felt. Colonel Kane was justly promoted to general and subsequently transferred to sector command. The surviving members of our battered regiment were awarded the prestigious Imperial Laurel and granted extended leave on worlds of their choosing, a small respite from endless war. I, myself, was offered a commission, the weighty opportunity to become an officer and, crucially, to train the next generation of soldiers who would inevitably face the very same horrifying challenges we had so recently endured. I accepted this commission, not because I particularly yearned for the responsibility, but because I knew, with a grim certainty, that someone absolutely had to pass on the hard-won, often bloody, lessons we had so painstakingly learned. This, then, is the unvarnished truth of military service in the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. We are not the embellished heroes depicted in glowing propaganda vids, nor the glorious, larger-than-life warriors of ancient, long-forgotten legend. We are quite simply ordinary people compelled to perform extraordinary, often horrific things because someone absolutely must. Because the terrifying alternative is far too terrible to even contemplate. We fight not for hollow glory or vainglorious conquest, but for the fundamental, simple right to exist, to continue drawing breath in a galaxy that seems utterly determined to extinguish all human life. The Emperor protects, they tirelessly proclaim, but his divine protection, we know, manifests through the resolute actions of mortal men and women who consciously choose to stand as an unbreakable shield between the fragile light of civilization and the encroaching, ravenous darkness of chaos. Every guardsman who steadfastly holds his position against seemingly impossible odds. Every soldier who bravely dies far from home in selfless service to strangers he will never meet. Every grizzled veteran who painstakingly passes on hard-won, often bloody, knowledge to raw recruits who might, just might, live long enough to utilize it. Each is a vital instrument of that sacred protection. We are the silent sentinels who stand watch in the deepest, darkest places where evil ceaselessly breeds. We are the tireless few who carry the fight directly to enemies that exist for no other purpose than to utterly destroy everything we hold sacred. We are the ones who pay the ultimate price in our own blood and sanity, enduring the slow, insidious erosion of everything that truly makes us human, also that others, somewhere, can sleep safely in their beds. This is the profound, brutal meaning of being a soldier in service to the God Emperor of mankind. This is the grim, uncompromising reality of life within the Imperial Guard. This is the bitter truth. They never truly tell you when they pin on your first set of rank insignia and send you off to die on worlds whose alien names you cannot even begin to pronounce. The galaxy is indeed vast, terrifyingly dark, and perpetually filled with unspeakable horrors that defy all human description. But it is also, crucially, filled with ordinary people who, despite everything, choose to stand and fight rather than surrender to soul-crushing despair. As long as that fundamental truth remains, as long as there are men and women willing to take up arms in resolute defense of humanity, there is hope. Not an abundance of hope, perhaps, but enough. The Emperor protects, they say, and we, in turn, protect the Emperor.